Morning, everybody. World War II ended in 1945, and the years after the war were quite tense. Very much uncertainty in Asia and Europe. And it was on this date, April 3, in 1948, that President Harry Truman signed legislation known as the Marshall Plan as one attempt to ease the crises in Western Europe. In February of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt flew all the way to Yalta on the Black Sea to meet with Stalin on the right, Churchill on the left, and the big question basically was what to do with Germany when the war is finished. A few months later, Roosevelt died in Georgia, and he'd been elected 4 times. For many people, he was the only president they'd known. So what about the new guy, Harry Truman? Here you see Truman taking the oath of office. So he was really an unknown quantity for most people. And what kind of president is he going to be in these tense times? The Allies had decided to divide up Germany after World War II into 4 zones, each zone occupied by the great powers, the Russians, the Americans, the Brits, and the French. And the same thing happened to Berlin, which was also divided into 4 zones. Berlin as a city was within the Russian zone. So this is why Berlin is the scene of so much high drama for decades after World War II. In July of 1945, Harry Truman went to Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, met with Churchill on the left, Stalin on the right, again to diffuse tensions. And soon after that meeting, the trial began of the Nazi bad guys, many of whom were executed. So this idea of what do we do with Germany, what do we do with former Nazis, this was a big deal. In January of 1946, the UN was formed. Now, you might recall after World War I, the League of Nations had been formed, but that was ineffective. So the hope was that the UN would learn from that and be better as an international organization. In March of 1946, while visiting Missouri, Truman's state, Winston Churchill gave a speech in which he came up with the image of the Iron Curtain separating communist and non-communist countries, and that stuck. So here's General Marshall. He was one of the few 5-star Army generals, and he became Secretary of State. And this is why the Marshall Plan has its name, because he was Secretary of State. But before our event, there was the Truman Doctrine, in which we gave aid to Turks and Greeks as they resisted communism. So this idea of aiding people to fight communism is not new. So here's the Marshall Plan, our event. Give aid to Western Europe to help them rebuild. The idea was if you're economically viable, then you can be politically viable, and this was part of the idea. Around the same time, the National Security Act was passed, and this reorganized the military, but it also created agencies like the CIA, which we associate with the Cold War, don't we? The man is holding a placard that says HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. So after the war, there's a lot of hunting for communists. And this trial of Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss, Chambers, a former communist, accused Hiss, who was an Ivy League type, of being a communist. This riveted the country. Stalin decided to put a blockade on Berlin, but he had allowed air travel, so the Allies came up with the Berlin Airlift. This went on over a year, and it kept Berlin from starving the Allied zones, and eventually Stalin quit the blockade. Now, Truman was elected in 1948. Nobody saw that coming, but he did, and it's a fascinating study, the election of 1948. And at the same time, NATO was formed, a military alliance of the Western powers up against the military alliance of Russia and its allies known as the Warsaw Pact. So Europe is still militarized. So in 1950, when the North Koreans invade South Korea and the Korean War begins, it's clear that the post-war world is going to be full of tension.